This is the 7th episode of an occasional podcast series in the afterlife of my documentary about Samuel Barber. These Capricorn conversations are with composers and musicians whose orbits have intersected with that famous gathering place called Capricorn, where Barber and Menotti also lived. I'm Paul Moon, and today's conversation is with composer Jon Deak at my studio in the East Village. Jon, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, great to be here.
Well, I mean, given where we are, I was kind of inspired to ask you about your memories of probably after you've arrived in New York City and you're finding your way as a composer. Your style is developing, and it interests me what influences you had besides, let's say, what they teach at conservatories. So there's a downtown performance art scene that crosses boundaries between rock music and visual art and so on. Sometimes we attribute that to Soho. We're here in the East Village. Tell me a little bit more about some of these people. And the names I've read are like John Cage, Salvatore Martirano, and others.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, coming to New York, first of all, back in the, early 60s. I mean, this goes back a long time. I was coming to New York primarily as an instrumentalist. I was a bassist, or trying to learn how to be a bassist. I had been, at first, at a very early age, having piano lessons in rural Indiana, and a piano teacher who encouraged me to take off. Well, she loved it when I would change the John Thompson teaching little fingers to play, and I would put my own little silly riffs on it. Believe me, I was no virtuoso or genius by a long shot, but she encouraged that. However, when I later went to Chicago and went to high school, I got discouraged from composing. Who do you think you are, Mozart or something like that, with more of these prestigious teachers? So I decided that I needed to become an instrumentalist first before I could go into composing. So I came in 63, it was, to Juilliard, no less. It was uptown then. And I was, as an instrumentalist, I always felt that belonged uptown, as it were, as far, up to 122nd Street and down to Lincoln Center, which was just opening at that time. But downtown, that was much more fertile, and a lot of grimy, gritty, wonderful stuff was happening down there.
So it feels like tourism to sort of map out that New York City history between, I think now they say uptown, midtown, downtown, and then it even farther breaks down into Soho and so on. But I just watched this documentary, The Velvet Underground, Todd Haynes's documentary about the band, but to my surprise, it traced even that sound to people like Lamont Young and this minimalist scene that was pretty active in that, latter part of last century. So you were navigating worlds, weren't you? You were eventually in the New York Philharmonic as a bassist, playing the contrabass.
Right.
But then you had another life here. So how did that manifest? And you've said that you did performance art and some theatrical integration of your talents. What was that?
Finally, as I was developing, and I had already reached the point where I was, sort of able to call myself a professional as a bassist, that coincided beautifully with my desire, long-standing desire to be a composer. And as I say, I was discouraged by the compositional techniques and the teaching at Oberlin and Juilliard, although there were many fine composers there, and I felt like I was already a new music specialist. But at the University of Illinois that year, when John Cage was there, Harry Parch was in and out, he was leaving, but I fell in love with his music, with John Cage's whole ethos, and Sal Marano was there, Ben Jonson, Charles Hamm. Oh my God, there was such composers there. So when I came to New York, which was the very next year, and managed to join the New York Philharmonic, I was already aware that I felt the New York Philharmonic was a little old-fashioned for me, and that I was attracted to the burgeoning music and art scene in Soho. And you mentioned Lamont Young, of course. Philip Glass was down there. Laurie Anderson was just starting. So many composers there. And the visual artists, Lichtenstein, all those, Motherwell, all those visual artists were there too. And I was just fascinated with both the music and the art scene in Soho. So I would play a rehearsal in the morning with the Philharmonic, the afternoon go into Soho, and maybe the evening, but we had 4, maybe 5 concerts a week in Lincoln Center at the Philharmonic. And so I was running back and forth all the time, but it was, wow, looking back, it was exciting.
So were there ever situations where you began to express yourself as a composer and performer in some non-traditional settings like lofts and theatrical and so on?
Absolutely, yeah. As I say, I'd begun really throwing myself into composing from the University of Illinois, and then I transferred that love and that energy, I guess, to New York in Soho, and in, as you say, in lofts, because the Soho at that time, remember, was still a lot of warehouses and a lot of huge empty raw spaces, and we performed there, and I had an instinct right away for theatrical performing, as a bassist, but also as a composer, and also as an actor. And I even brought in my visual art. As I say, my parents were visual artists, not musicians. And I had gotten very heavily into sculpture, more of a geographical, abstract style. Jean Arp, the surrealist sculptor, was a great inspiration for me. Also, Giorgio de Chirico, who was a painter, a seminal painter who inspired Max Ernst and Dali and Miro and Tanguy and all those guys. So I was very much into that. And being both a maverick at the Philharmonic, remember, in those days, first of all, they were all men, and they actually wore coat and tie to rehearsals. My first rehearsal in what was then Philharmonic Hall, I showed up in a green dashiki of African descent, blue jeans and hiking boots. So they marked me as a rebel upstart right away. But I was not a loudmouth. I was a shy person. But I couldn't fit in too well. But as it turned out, I have to give credit to the Philharmonic because it didn't fire me. As long as I played my part well and all that and did the work, which was not easy. I mean, you can have all these irascible, demanding conductors of that age, starting with Bernstein. That was quite a load to carry, but I had so much energy left to go downtown and do the performance art scene.
And this all paints an interesting picture that might help explain, or at least the detective work of how we end up with your body of work that is performed now worldwide, but in particular by certain chamber music ensembles, how I know you through the 21st Century Consort, who's committed to perform many of your works. But there's something that audiences look forward to when it's a Jon Deak work, that it's a little bit maverick in that sense where, for example, there is a theatrical quality to your compositions that are, is it narrative? Is it acting? What you do is you make the musicians, or I should say you call upon the musicians to act, if you will, to play a part by saying things, speaking things, becoming characters. So this is the background that sets that up. Where did that start? Is there a particular piece that you composed where you really started tiptoeing into that realm?
I think from the very first, I was also inspired by George Crumb, for instance, from when when I was at the University of Illinois, I mean, he came there once or twice, using the poetic evocation of sounds, and I was impressed with the musicality of speech. I had just come from a year in Italy and really got into learning the language there and how it affected my brain very much, and the rhythm of that speech and how it wait, are we gonna and how it affects music. Why the music of Rossini da 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 sounds different than the music of Claude Debussy. How we speak is how we write music willy-nilly. I mean, Aaron Copland doesn't sound like Mussorgsky because they spoke different languages. And furthermore, I felt that as I'm speaking, I'm not speaking in a monotone. Obviously, it's music. Everybody knows that. Also, musical instruments inflect musical speech. Not just compositions, but the actual sound of an instrument. A violin glissing downward can sound like but it can sound you have so many shades of emotion and expression that I started to develop a language which I called, off of the word speak playing, Arnold Schoenberg. It was a little bit of a stealing from the old guy, because he initiated Sprechstimme, which is speak singing. I called it speak playing, Sprechspiel or Sprechspiel, however the proper German is. And I would have whole conversations of instruments. And what it would sound like was inevitably comic. Okay, to me, to compose a piece of music, it has to go from here to there. And if it was minimal, like was in the rage at the time, and I was very influenced, it can be from here to there in a straight line. Or it can be from here to there as a form, like a sonata form, where you use different themes and they come back, or theme and variations. Or it can be a storyline. And so I would have a story. I started out as a kind of a absolute music composer, but I veered into telling a story. And I loved that. And I could actually have the instruments tell the story, and then later the musicians to speak verbally. And in the case of a flute, for instance, you can sort of blend your verbal speech into playing the instrument at the same time. I never knew that would be possible until I saw a flutist do that. Robert Dick and Thomas Howell and a few other flutists. I said, wow, you're imitating human speech. Jimi Hendrix also did that with his guitar. So these kind of things affected me as a composer and as an instrumentalist.
In fact, I read something that if we could take a moment to just completely geek out on one of my other favorite composers besides you, is I saw in an interview you mentioned that an early childhood, really early childhood formative experience was going to Chicago Symphony and hearing Janacek's Sinfonietta. And Janacek is an example of a composer who was a bit maverick, but also incorporated folk music, folk tales, and so on. But what I think of with Janacek is his operas and the way that he did seem to make an effort to write melodic lines that were intimately related to the way things sound when they're spoken. So already a composer who is seeing trying to track, or actually trying to remove the distinction between speaking and playing music.
Oh, wonderful.
So tell me about that experience, if you will, and how Janacek might have ignited that. Granted, Sinfonietta is an instrumental piece, but maybe there's even traces of that in Sinfonietta.
Yeah, no, he did. He was a master, if one can use that word, of speech in music and the music in speech. So I really loved the idea of flowering the speech into music, and pressing the music in back into speech. It was something that really attracted me.
There's an innocent quality to just simply saying, what is the difference between saying something and playing something with an instrument? And why do we have these boundaries? What's the big difference? And that inevitably, why do people even speak? Why do they say anything? And sometimes what we're naturally inclined to do is just to tell stories and to hook onto stories. What we might even have a reason to say anything at all is just to tell a story. So in your works, they have been modeled after, if you will, archetypal or canonical stories. You've got Jack and the Beanstalk, The Ugly Duckling, The Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, on the cusp of Halloween as we are right now. So, the so-called great composers would just put a number on a piece and put it into sonata form. So, but at the same time, I've heard you push back against the idea of being a composer of children's music, even though these are stories that have been, beloved by children. So what is that distinction all about?
Well, as you say, I never wrote a piece for children. On the other hand, I never really wrote a piece for adults either. I didn't, which one can say by extension, the academics, or as one composer told me, mainstream. I want to be a mainstream composer. Well, what is that? Okay, I could rebel against anything. But the point is that I wanted music to communicate. Just as I'm communicating to you now, if I speak in a different language, you probably wouldn't understand me, no matter how well I would be speaking, and you might note my emotions, my inflections, my rhythm, my intonation, but you wouldn't understand the words. I don't think music expresses itself only in words. I mean, that's also a truism. Music speaks beyond words. So you don't have to speak Russian in order to hear anyone, Stravinsky, Mussorgsky, any of the Glinka, any of those composers. They either speaks to you or it doesn't. However, I think symphonic music, if I may go into that area, which has been such a profound achievement of humanity, has somewhat gotten, it's at a crossroads, sort of. The pop music and all the, I don't want to just say pop music, but so many forms of contemporary music bypass the symphony orchestra. And I think that's a shame, because I think the symphony orchestra, with all its incredible history and personality that has gone into each of those instruments. I mean, how old is the flute? How old is the violin? And where did it start and express itself from Appalachia to India to Scandinavia? The violin goes back probably beyond the Neolithic. I think that's of profound importance. All of those instruments speak to us of deep parts of ourselves that would be a great loss for us to ignore. You can amplify them, you can alter them electronically and so forth, and have just completely electronic music too. I'm not against any of that. But you do need to maintain also that core of humanity, that just like, I'm just feeling my heart right now. I mean, yeah, it's mine. It's been with me all my life. But where did I inherit that heart from? I mean, it's not a mechanical thing that somebody invented. It dates back, well, something like that dates back a billion years probably to some protozoa. But the symphony orchestra has this depth to it. Where is the new music going to come from? Is it going to bypass the symphony orchestra? I think that would be a shame, whatever. I believe in its power and its lasting significance, okay? I just believe that. And I think, you mentioned children, adults, da-da. I think that we've been ignoring the child. And not that I want to speak only to the child and say, yeah, Mary had a little lamb. Mary, you like that little tune? I want to hear from the child because they carry this ancient part of themselves. They inherited all their flesh, their organs, their brain, their soul, as it were, from thousands, millions of years before. I want to hear because they're closer to that origin than I am. That old saw, everyone from Picasso to, I don't know, has said, all children are born artists. The problem is remaining one because we forget about it. Why is that? Because the child is a little closer to the creation, okay? Mm-hmm. And I want to hear that creation. I think it's very profound. So that's why I listen to children now.
That's so interesting. I mean, it reminds me of the thing that I guess as you get older, you want to recover the amplified sensations that you had as a child. And there's never more a ripe time, or child sociologists and psychologists, specifically diagnose that you are most affected, you're most absorbing of your environment when you're young. Mm-hmm. It's no coincidence that parents who want to treat their kids to amazing experiences don't present them with just little delicate, intimate things. Mm-hmm. They want to show them big things that make kids go, wow,
Yeah.
And a symphony orchestra just, it's not too much at once. I don't think that children, cower under the gigantic sound of 100 instruments or so playing. No. It's actually suitable for their openness to new experiences and gigantic experiences. You make an interesting case then for something that, if you're saying that symphony orchestras are sort of endangered, if you will, what is also true, though, is that they're very institutional, because how do you pull off organizing that many people and paying their salaries? And also the barriers to entry for composers are pretty high. There's only so many symphony orchestras available to any given composer. So one more comment I have to make is that I went to the New York Philharmonic last weekend, and it was the first time after moving here that I really was actually able to hear them, for heaven's sake. It's been so long that they've been dark. But I guess I left with more than anything else a sense that the stakes, especially for that institution, are very high. People pay attention to that orchestra because it has such an incredibly legendary history. It's one of the best in the world. And the stakes are high. The stakes are high.
Very true. Yes, and thank you for saying that about the orchestra. That it really does have something which is profound beyond its the institution of it. And yes, I have to use that horrible word, infrastructure. Well, actually, not a horrible word. It's a necessary thing. It's not like just giving a kid a blank wall and a paintbrush and a pot of colors. The child can go, and in fact, they do. Kids as young as 4 or 5 express profound emotions with their paintings, and that's what inspired me, by the way, to do. Why can't kids do this with music? Well, people will say right away, a kid can't notate. They don't even know what treble clef is. How could they transpose for the clarinet? How could they put together all these instrumental things? Well, the infrastructure, that is an adult thing, and we can handle that. What we don't handle is the actual creation of the music itself. The composer brings the score, copyists copy out the parts, and so on. Why can't we do that for children? So I was doubtful myself at first at the At what kind of magnitude could it be for a child of 9, 10, 11 years old enough to, read and write and follow a sequential task? But what kind of music would they actually produce?
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies a long story that I've had the great gift and pleasure of observing and expressing and taking part in.
Well, I guess we should talk about very young composers then. I mean, I still want to get to you and your work apart from that, for sure, and including, of course, The Passion of Scrooge, which where there's already plenty of. But no, let's talk about that, because you are the founder of Very Young Composers, and let's just, if you may, quickly just tell the story that starts actually, I read in Brooklyn with Marin Alsop, which ended up at first in Colorado. But yes, how did this start?
Well, just briefly, yeah. I was working with Marin, and I knew her as a violinist. She was a budding conductor, and we had done some school activities in schools. And this was a school in Brooklyn, very very diverse, and not one of your elite schools by a long shot. And I was looking at the halls as we walked to a classroom. There was paintings on the walls by kids 5 years old, and I said to her, "Wait a minute, look at this. This is a 5-year-old here. That looks like a Kandinsky. This one, look at those little lines there. Those stick figures are made. They're obviously Paul Klee saw a child doing that. And that one over there looks like Willem de Kooning with the horribly disfigured eyes and so forth. Why can't children compose as profoundly and beguilingly and with such depth as that?" And then again, as I said before, it was the infrastructure problem that we, the adults, can handle. The kids can handle the creativity of it. So I wangled myself as with the Meet the Composer program of John Duffy to start in Denver and try. Like I explained to the Philharmonic, which I remain loyal to all my life. But I said, look, I have to try out this idea. And you don't want to open your play right on Broadway. You want to open it in Hartford or Schenectady or something. So I said, I want to try this idea out that kids can write for the symphony orchestra in Denver. And boy, it took me a lot longer than I expected to hone anything like a curriculum whereby kids started to catch fire and do exactly what I was beginning to realize they could do. I wasn't at all convinced of this at first. And then
Marin Alsop was seated at the Colorado Symphony.
She had just become music director there, yeah. And of course she was very supportive of all that, and as were a lot of other people, most notably Christopher Kendall of the 21st Century Consort, as you mentioned, and other places. And for about 20 years there, I was primarily involved in, well, I was still an instrumentalist, obviously, and a contemporary music specialist, both of other composers. I love to play the music of other contemporary composers on the bass or in an ensemble, but also as composer of my own works. And I would go around to other orchestras began to do my works as well. Like you say, the Jack and the Beanstalk, or the Legend of Spuyten Duyvil, or the Snow Queen, or the, orchestras from Atlanta to Minneapolis to San Francisco to Denver to, St. Louis and
National Symphony.
The National Symphony was one of my favorite places. Geez, it was way back in the days of Slava Rostropovich. Oh my goodness! And so anyway, all that was again coaxing instrumentalists to go beyond. Well, I wrote virtuosic music that required professionals, but in addition or beyond that, they had to realize that they were on stage as performers, because this whole, I mean, look at this whole cliche of on stage, the performers are wearing black, formal. They're looking, you look at them and they have probably been discouraged from showing expression or joy or emotions in the music that they're playing. And conversely, the audience is discouraged from moving. Good Lord, what is that about? I mean, you look at any rock concert, I mean, people are not only moving, they're enjoying themselves, gesticulating, commenting, singing along. And the musicians, do I have to even say how crazy and wonderful the musicians are with their outlandish costumes and clothing, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And I'm not saying that people should go bare-chested in the symphony orchestra hall, but for heaven's sake, how can you not dance to a Beethoven symphony? I mean, really. I sit there on my hands. I have to go into the back of the hall because people get annoyed and I'm moving to the music, and oh my God, I go to Finland and I listened to the Sibelius Fifth Symphony by one of the national symphonies there, and played in the original hall. I had to go to the back of the hall because even there, I move too much the music. People get annoyed, or they think it's distracting. Distracting? How could it be distracting? One of the few conductors I've ever seen, I'm going off on a thing here.
No, I got it.
One of the few conductors I've seen who recognizes this is my old friend and teaching artist, James Blatchley. Now, he has an orchestra, an experiential orchestra, I believe it. He did a performance down at Paolo Prestini's National Sawdust, right? Where he played the Rite of Spring of Stravinsky and encouraged people to dance to it. Oh my God, there was no problem at all, baby. That piece makes you want to, dance, or just, I don't know, just move and get that gritty stuff, that passion, that red anger, and that glorious opening of the second part where are we? We're in some mysterious realm, and how can you, I mean, I'm moving right now how can you not move with that stuff? So anyway, that marks me as a
probably easier to get the audience to do that in Williamsburg than Midtown, right? But by the way, similarly, there was an experiment where the New York Philharmonic dabbled in something called New York Philharmonic 360 at the drill hall of the Park Avenue Armory. And again, it was an attempt to try and at least reconfigure the relationship between the audience and the orchestra. But I have to say, ultimately, it was pretty much the same thing, because people still were duty bound to their chairs, their assigned seats. It wasn't like something else I experienced there years ago and filmed, actually. John Luther Adams had something he sort of wrote, if you will, called a Nuksut, where it was truly encouraged. You would have people lying on the floor in anywhere they wanted, and the relationship between the audience and the players, the musicians, the composer, was completely democratized. Wow, and I wonder whether that's in the future for orchestral music even, which is pretty difficult to organize. And the New York Philharmonic 360 degrees.
Right.
You don't want people wandering around and tripping on a $1 million violin, let's say. Yeah.
How do you reconcile all of that? Yeah, I love John Luther's music and his whole attitude. He's a radical. We got Meet the Composer grants at the same time, so we were in a sort of a graduating class of that. He went to Fairbanks, Alaska, and I went to Denver. And I just love his stuff, and his whole ethos is really just very outstanding.
But back to children.
There's no reason why that music could not be incorporated by the Philharmonic. You don't want to play the Beethoven Symphony on your $1 million violin and then have somebody dancing around on it. you could play a piece of that and then have your intermission or the next night or something, and then do the other thing. We noted that during the pandemic, even the Philharmonic and certainly all the other arts organizations became much more flexible in terms of their reach the audiences that they were playing for by force. They couldn't stay in their big halls with 3,000 people packed in like sardines like we do. So I think that was one of maybe the gifts of the pandemic.
So getting inside children's heads, and as that goes, I mean, it's funny how at concerts, if there are children, allowed into the symphony hall or something, they're the ones who always want to get up and try things. They want to go walk up to the stage. Sometimes you'll find a stray kid, as if they've escaped from a prison, and they'll make their way onto the stage and no, that's wrong. You can't do that. But along those lines, you've noted that most children are surrounded with what we call pop music. It's a certain type of music, and it comes in many forms. But in general, you could say is that it's sort of, I don't know if light's the right word, but doesn't have that gigantic gravitas of what we kind of typically call classical music.
Yeah.
But you've also said that when they are finally empowered to compose, to write something, that they themselves change the style compared to what they absorb all day long. If it's them who are going to express themselves, they adopt a slightly different gravitas and tone. What's going on there? Have you figured that out, and have you exploited it?
Well,
or I should say facilitated it.
Yeah, that's kind of what we do. And at the first, kids have to be convinced of many things. For one thing, that you're listening to them and taking note, taking seriously what they are coming forth with. I mean, seriously, quote unquote, because they may come forth with something really silly or funny or farcical even. And that's okay. And that, or angry and resentful or confused or whatever, all those emotions are okay. And it takes the children a while to feel safe. And how do you do that? By a number of ways. I love to use the term zeitgeist because it, I don't know, not that I'm even a German expert or anything, and it's not a German quality by any means, it's a universal. The spirit of the times. In other words, the spirit of the kids around you. If one child makes a breakthrough compositionally, for instance, recently we had in the composer classes that we called the bridge classes. We have the very young composers in grade school, and then we added for the middle school kids who are dealing with a whole different set of emotions and feelings and attitudes and sophistication level and so forth, not necessarily better than the children who are in grade school, but different, just very different. And I wanted them to be familiar with writing for the human voice. So we had a blues singer come in, we had 2 opera singers come in and talk about, not just sing for them, but to sing their music. Say, okay, Mrs. So-and-so is coming in next week, and write either a melody or 4 sounds that you want her to make, whatever. But the kids were having trouble. They were struggling with writing music. Scansion, range, certain syllables. Scansion refers to, the accent. You don't want to have a, I am going outside. I am going outside. I am, you want it to scan the way you would speak, unless you wanted to make an exception, which is always, composers are always making exceptions, of course. So we don't force them into anything, but we want them to be aware of a singer, of, I don't want to go further into that. The point is that one kid made a breakthrough. She wrote a song that just bang, And all the instruction that the kids had was focused on that one or two kids, I don't forget, who broke through and understood what it. Then all of them felt empowered to do it, but not in imitation. It was amazing. Nobody plagiarized anybody. We've almost never have had that problem. They all want to express themselves, but then it becomes the zeitgeist of it. Means that there's a class spirit that can spill over into other classes, that kids can actually say, oh, this is our language, and it is a different language. Not only that, but you can tell the difference between a child in Korea from their piece from a kid from Brooklyn or a kid from Scandinavia, or especially, a kid from Africa. Oh my God, they don't even call their pieces down there. We worked in Malawi and Kenya. They don't call them pieces or music. They call them beats. I mean, the whole concept of music is different in these various places. South America, oh my God. So this kind of advance, you might say, it's not even advance, it's familiarity. It's filling, it's like, you know what this whole thing is like? It's like standing on the shore of a new continent, Paul. It's like it's not, like we're going to exploit the Indians there or anything like that. We're standing on the shore of something that's undiscovered, and we're going to express ourselves within it, and it takes a while. But that idea of the discovery of a new musical continent, it has stayed with me in all the countries I've ever been in. The three countries which have, to me, the greatest music education and most innovative music education systems in the world, surprisingly, are South Korea, Venezuela, because of El Sistema, and Finland, because music there is the national thing. It's like the New York Yankees there, the symphony orchestra. New York Yankees plus your rock star plus, I mean, everything you combine. And just to go into those countries and actually have them say, why didn't we think of this before? Why didn't we think that a 10-year-old couldn't write a piece of compelling depth that I want to listen to? It's a different language. You have to, you kind of almost have to learn the language of the people of that age writing. I don't want to just say children. It's not a children's, but it is a sort of different language. And once you get used to it, you hear all kinds of things in it.
It reminds me of that sort of gut instinct I had that the stakes are high when you go to an institution like the New York Philharmonic. No emphasis on institution. But have you seen examples of children who seem to be setting aside, if you will, their short attention spans or frivolity and a gravitas just sort of comes from nowhere, or at least comes from the future, or comes from an inexplicable place? What comes to my mind is Samuel Barber, for example. Some of his earliest pieces, such as Dover Beach, there is such deep, deep melancholy. And the kid is, just coming out of his teens. And he's already writing some of the most despairing, deep, heavy, lifelong despair music that has such wisdom in it. Children appear to be able to access that. Where is that coming from? Or I put it another way, how do you get that out of them? Is it real?
Okay, yeah, well, of course it's real. And I'm trying to think of analogies. At a certain age, kids are able to form speech and understand spoken word. That happens obviously somewhere between the age of 1 and 2. At another age, they're able to draw and paint, as I say, with depth and profundity. That starts happening at age 4, 5, 6. There is an age at which, because of the sequential quality of music, kids become aware and able to put forth at age 8, 9, 10, 11. I've worked with kindergartners musically, and they do compose really nifty tunes. But there's not, I don't see an evident ability to sequence ideas, to come forth with an, I'm not talking about symphonic development as much as I am just filling in the details of a piece of music. I'm always talking about details. I'll draw a circle on the whiteboard or whatever, and I'll say, what does that circle tell you about my sister? Well, that she has a head. Well, what else is there about her? She's angry. Well, go ahead and draw something that makes angry. It draws an eyebrow. Okay, why is she angry? So another kid comes up and draws her mouth down in a frown. She's angry because I stole her toy or something. And the details that accumulate of that drawing, sometimes somebody suddenly decides a thunderstorm is coming onto her head, or that a building is falling on her, or that she's helping a bird to fly, that has hurt its wing or something. All kinds of emotions. The details of that are there. Now, you say the attention span, and I've found not only the attention span, but a kid with ADHD, like I had, or maybe still have, can only concentrate for 30 seconds at the most, and then they're climbing the walls. So one thing that I tell my teaching artists right away, 2 words to remember: patience and persistence. We learn that as composers. I had to teach myself that as a composer, that I had to be patient with my idea. It was impossible. I just saw a book in your bookcase there. It said a writer's job is to go to bed angry and to wake up even angrier. Well, I mean, all those.
Harlan Ellison, yeah.
And you have to realize that there is a process. So as a composer, you can't just write. Well, maybe Mozart could, I don't know, but most composers, and certainly myself, labor over a piece. There are many rough drafts and over time. We can't expect the child to just, So I'll take a kid for 30 seconds, starts climbing the walls. Okay, and I'll wait. We'll talk about something else. Okay, what comes next? What comes next? What comes next? All these things gradually coalesce into a whole, which, despite the child, and sometimes they don't even realize the depth of what they're composing. I mean, to veer off from the story, a kid in Finland, how old was she? 9, 10. She started composing this piece, and one of my teaching artists over there had to notate it for her, but she sang everything. Kids in Finland, they all sing from age 3 or 4. So she's able to sing things. She started with a beautiful kind of minuet, waltz in 3. It's beautiful. It got a little more fraught with something, a couple of minor chords. And by the way, we show the kids, don't tell me that that's a minor 7th chord. Tell me how it makes you feel. So the kids, by the way, they learn that at age 7 or 8. They can't tell you what a major chord is, a tonic, dominant, to save their lives, but they hear the difference. So this girl, it gradually morphed into an A minor, horrible marching theme with a tuba. She had to have a tuba blatting at its highest volume, and strings with down bows, horrible like that. And then it faded into something that was totally like in the clouds. It was like a George Crumb kind of atmospheric thing. What was that about? Oh my God. Vivi was her name. You've written the history of your country. The waltzing kind of thing that you get in Scandinavia from the Swedes, who dominated Finland for so many years, and then from the other side, the Stalinist march of the soldiers breaking in on that. And then in the end, what happens after Finnish independence? It goes off into the clouds. The profundity of that piece, just all our mouths dropped open. That's what prompted the Finns to say, why didn't we think of this before? And their kids, oh my God, one of their kids wrote a piece about a volcano that would just do, I don't know, you name any of your great composers now. I don't want to start, but a description, a gutsy description of a volcano in a 3-minute orchestra piece that just knocked everybody's socks off.
So I struggle with a certain paradox because you make a great case for the fact that what children need is encouragement. Okay,
Yeah.
That's the killer ingredient to, and it's interesting because earlier you said that they need to feel safe, and I guess I kind of get that. I mean, if you're a kid, you're surrounded by danger constantly, and you're learning how to be safe, and you find out that you can get hurt by whatever, tripping or touching the hot stove or whatever. So I get that that's an instinct. What becomes a paradox to me is the universe of music conservatories that are really the breeding ground for all this great music that we listen to. So on the one hand, can you solve this dilemma I have, which is that I do treasure the fact that we have one last kind of cultural institution where we can go to a concert and hear music performed immaculately to the most ridiculously high standards, where it's almost like a gladiator sport where you're kind of waiting for somebody to screw up just a tiny bit because then it's really dramatic, So there's that atmosphere, and we say, how nice in a world of endless mediocrity to have perfection, On the flip side, it sounds like the tactics, or at least the environment of a music conservatory, can be very punishing, can be very not encouraging,
confining,
confining. And yet kids are the ones who need, to beg the cliche, they need discipline the most. So how do you reconcile those two worlds? What is the way to make, if you will, great music with the high stakes that can fill up an orchestra with sound?
Yeah. It takes time, patience, funding, and it doesn't happen right away. But it happens. And the vehicle for that being the symphony orchestra or bands and ensembles. I mean, it doesn't have to be classical by a long shot, but that infrastructure vehicle that you speak of with such love, and I share totally. I mean, I spent my whole youth learning how to play an instrument classically to the greatest level of perfection that I could manage. Let me just put it this way simply. When a child, like I mentioned that composition by Vivi, now if her grade school orchestra or even the high school orchestra played that piece, it would be something and it would be quite amazing. But to hear the Helsinki Philharmonic play that piece and put it up at that level that you're talking about, that exquisite level of perfection and beauty, and take it seriously, makes the piece rise to a certain level. I mean, it's like, you can't make an analogy. I mean, I'm trying to, with the visual art, you can take a painting and put it in a horrible light, and you can take a Rembrandt and make it really look horrible if you put it in the wrong light. But if you make a good light without changing a single brush stroke of the painting, you can make it look fantastic by the correct lighting. And that's what happens with these kids' music. You give it the same seriousness, and I must say, all the orchestras that I've worked with, I have yet to find an orchestra that, even though they may react if, this is just a kid's piece, we don't need to rehearse it. Excuse me, this is contemporary music, and in some cases it's much more difficult than your run of the whatever contemporary piece, because this is fresh from the mind of a kid who doesn't realize that the first violin section is supposed to be playing in a higher octave than the second violin section. They don't know that. And yet they know the instrument. They love it. They hear it played by Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, and they start writing creatively for it. So that gap, that paradox, can be bridged by taking these kids' pieces seriously, just as taking my own music or that of Joe Schwantner or any of your, or for that matter, John Luther Adams you mentioned. that stuff has to be performed well. If you don't perform it well, it's going to bomb for sure. Like a good Broadway play, it's got to be done well.
Yeah, the idea of children rising to the occasion makes perfect sense when you sort of absorb the reality that there is never a more malleable and never a more the world is your oyster time than when you're a kid. My dad's a child sociologist or a sociologist who specialized in children. And his thesis was focused on the way that it's kind of game over by the time you're even 6 months old. But in any case, who you are is so heavily defined. It's logarithmic, isn't it? In terms of, mathematically, if you will. And we just become set in our ways and our methods and our attitudes. But when you describe, I love the visual. You talk about this continent of awakening, if you will, that is available to us if we give children, young people, set the bar very high. And the orchestra sort of epitomizes that, doesn't it? It's like one instrument, but many instruments. But when they know that they have that, don't they rise to the occasion? Isn't that presenting them with something that says, this will be great because it's already great, and here you need to play your part in this great thing?
Yeah. And as I say, it takes, beyond the infrastructure of the whole thing, it takes time, and it takes that catchy zeitgeist business that the kids not only feel safe and empowered, but they feel that they know how to do it. And it becomes, as you say, malleable. Yeah, a kid is, it's set. You learn your language at such an early age. You say 6 months. Yeah, that's true. But other things do remain malleable up until God knows when. Maybe you're 85. I don't know.
Okay.
But that certainly that age, 8, 9, 10, before puberty hits, and if you can grab them there and say you are an artist, whatever you're going to be in life, you remain an artist, and I say that to every single one of them. They can do that transition into adolescence and teenagehood without losing that God-given artistic ability that they're born with.
Yeah. Well, this all sounds like a lot of philosophizing, but there's also the mechanics of what very young composers processes. So one thought that I had, I was just intrigued or curious about your embrace of technology, if you will. I mean, really, one of the roles that a very young composer's facilitator is playing is to notate, to convert something into the, if you will, academic language of
that a musician could play.
You got to distribute scores to a certain number of. So that thing can be, I hate to use this word, it can be mechanized, can't it?
Yeah.
And so are we looking also at a future where, in the same way that like my Alexa, I hope it might even ding when I said Alexa to trigger it, but it does speech transcription, speech recognition, and understands what you're saying.
Oh yeah.
Is any of this problematic to you, that there will be machines that simply hear humming and can begin to construct compositions for children?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Wow, you bring up a lot of issues. First of all, yes, we do embrace technology. There's no choice because it's here. I do have to. I have a problem with some kids, not all kids, who grab the computer or the GarageBand or links in programs on the computer and just start punching buttons randomly, and they wind up with compositions you can tell right away are written automatically or written by the computer. And the computers are complex. I'm not trying to say that they're simple. I mean, a computer can beat the world chess master, right? So there's a lot of thought going in there, but the computer is making the choices, not the human. And what interests us is not like, to say, a baseball player can hit a home run If it's 450 feet, that's a big deal. A machine could hit it 10 times as far. So are we going to the ball field to see a machine hit a baseball when it's thrown a curveball at 105 miles an hour? We're not paying that money for the tickets to see that. We're seeing a human being versus another human being, and all that human reaction. We're going to an orchestra or to a rock concert because we're seeing a human linking him or herself up with a musical instruments, whether they're electronic or not. And Laurie Anderson was one of the first to kind of realize that in a classical way, the crossover business of that, in retained human personality. There's no, I don't feel threatened by it. However, a child has to learn to use that with attention. I'm forgetting the word. With cognition, with thinking, and to use the technology rather than let the technology use the child. Because a child can complete an assignment, write a 10-bar melody. Yeah, you can just press a couple buttons and do that. But it's not, I guarantee you, it's not going to be as interesting as if the child did. We have an exercise that one of my teaching hours is, write the worst melody in the world. And boy, is that a fun exercise, because kids come with all stupid kinds of melodies, and when they're played by good instrumentalists or something, or sung together on a high level, they don't sound so bad. Mm-hmm. The human quality of choosing what sounds beautiful, ugly, weird, terrible, makes it of interest to us. It just is of interest to us. You don't have to worry about technology. It's just, but you do have to use it like getting into. One kid said, writing for an orchestra was one thing, but then writing on the computer to put my score into Sibelius or Finale score program. He said that felt like I was sitting in a Lamborghini sports car without knowing how to drive. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, there's a profound comment. It's true. Writing for humans on an instrumental basis was doable, was not that daunting.
It reminds me of when I was a kid. I do feel like for anybody who grew up in the recently, or even a few decades ago, the grand opera of our time was movies. Okay, and as a filmmaker, I'm biased towards that medium as being like the ultimate, combination of every type of media and sensation and style.
Absolutely.
And there, it's also to place it in a specific period. You had the rise of symphonic music in film scores that actually sort of didn't exist on the type of scale that it does now, where it's like every darn movie, even a comedy, might have a full orchestra. You have things like space operas, these action movies. So, of course, growing up, Star Wars figures in the dirt, playing in the sand, reenacting scenes from these movies. What I remember as a kid was that while I'm having Luke Skywalker battle with Darth Vader with his lightsabers or something. This is all very embarrassing but I was a kid, But when that happened, I heard that music, but it wasn't even the themes that were written. It was my own stuff that I was just using the orchestral sound palette to make. And so what I'm getting at is sometimes even in dream sleep, which is not rich for me, it's not like I come up with great things when I'm dreaming. It's usually chaos. But I have memories of a few times when I woke up at some point in the middle of sleep and said, I think I just had a completely new, gigantic composition that was happening, in my synapses somehow.
Wow. And
if there were a way to quickly and fast sort of transpose, to notate that, to preserve what happens in that playful, play acting world as a child, I just felt like that would have been the coolest thing ever. And technology, it's possible that technology can do things like that. The more we can tap into the ways our brains fire.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, there's your continent, and in another form, I guess, is what I mean.
Another form, yeah.
Well, I definitely want to at least get to a couple of Jon Deak specifics, which includes, The Passion of Scrooge. I can't pass it by. But to be honest, I just have to commend people to watch. There's a making of documentary that runs a half hour that I'll link to, but that also is a good place for people to just get acquainted with that piece. But it's definitely one of your, I don't know if there are more than one magnum opus allowed for a composer, but it's certainly a cherished piece of music. And I made an opera film of it, which was a way of reinventing it in a certain way to put the composer's identity front and center. I guess since we've covered so much ground, even in the documentary, ultimately, I just ask you, if you reflect back, if you position yourself 10, 20 years from now, you'll still be with us. What will you think about that piece fitting into your life?
Well, the piece was a high point of both technical, attention to the technique of composing. The traditional technique, not so much the technology, because it was all written for acoustic instruments. Granted, the extended percussive sounds were some of them were kind of new, but basically it's for a traditional chamber symphony. The piece was also autobiographical in the sense that it reflected to me a crisis of my own life and a feeling of redemption. There's a redemption, a spiritual redemption in that fantastic story of Dickens that never failed to grab one. Although it took me quite a while to realize the depth of that thing, because sometimes it happens as you're writing, and you have no idea how good your piece is or how bad it is until it's finished. And I did that, whatever. 10 or 20 years from now, it'll probably be a period piece for me, reflecting a certain style. I'm writing another piece which was intended to sort of be a companion of that, and it's based on a Scandinavian folktale, and is a sort of holiday piece along with Scrooge, like the Christmas Eve miracles, which are ubiquitous in all cultures, whether they're Christmas or not. Certain times when animals can speak, or there's a truce between humans and animals, and that's a fascinating concept for me. So, to answer your point, we will see because Scrooge was basically written 20 some years ago. We'll see what Deak comes up with these two. There's another piece that I'm writing for quartet and voice. We'll see how that compares with those other pieces, because 20 years before Scrooge, I wasn't writing pieces that would compare with that at all. There was definitely a transition, a change there.
So you've mentioned biographical, spiritual. What role does any religious practice play in your composing life? And I ask that actually not to be too specific, but more so, some composers actually are very deliberate in that. They'll write actually in the form of a mass, or they'll, or maybe it was just the gig that they had, right? Maybe Bach wasn't necessarily a Bible thumper, but he was getting paid weekly to write sacred music.
Yeah.
Why don't you write any of that? Is a simplistic way of putting it.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought along those lines. I consider myself a spiritual person. In fact, I do go to church now, amazingly, and kind of ecumenical church that embraces both, well, any of the, as they call it, Abrahamic religions, but I never wanted to write a canonical piece like a mass or a cantata even, based on scripture.
It's great literary material, though, isn't it?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's both literary and musical. Geez, if you think of all that. And so much of the past music is not logical. There was an attempt and here I'm going in dangerous ground. There's an attempt toward the beginning up to the middle, maybe even later 20th century, to make music logical. And my dear Pierre Boulez, who I admire greatly, and we had a wonderful relationship, but we differed so much in our aesthetic. And I asked him if he expected the public to understand his piece on the logical level of which he conceived it. Didn't matter, almost all of his music. And he said, well, you do not open a book on nuclear physics and expect to understand it right away. And I thought, well, that can be music, and there is a place for that logical, scientific thinking. And we are all nowadays this big deal. Do you believe in science? There's the climate change and all that, or do you think it's all bullshit? But musically, a lot happens in the pre-conscious, the parts of the brain that don't respond to that, and that's why I think children have access to that part more clearly than adults do, unless the adult remains as a child.
What's getting in the way right now, us adults? What's the problem here?
Oh my God, where to start?
Well,
you mean as a concert goer, or
no? What's preventing us from being composers, for example?
Yeah.
Cognitive dissonance is a fun.
Well, music. Yeah, it's difficult to politicize music at all because look at all the there's fine music even written or films made in Hitler's Germany, but the world needs more artists. I mean, people say, oh, they can't find employment. Well, that's not the point of becoming an artist. As they say in El Sistema, which I admire greatly, it's not that you're going to all play in a symphony orchestra. It's that you give a street child a violin or a clarinet, and he becomes a citizen. Okay, I get that profoundly, and that's what we need. We need that kind of self awareness, self-esteem, and I think that will guide us into the future. Because when a person becomes aware of themselves enough and feel confident enough, that's when they become caring. Okay, and the world definitely needs more caring. That's what's going to get us through all these crises of war, politics, and especially the climate crisis. You've got to care. For whom? For your grandchildren. Hello? That's, I mean, I'm out of here in whatever X number of years, but the kids I work with are going to be alive at the end of this century. I have to care about them in order to, to do something intelligent. And in order to care about them, I have to feel a certain center in myself. I don't know how to put it.
Well, to wrap up, I mean, as to you and what you are and what you do, you're a mountain climber. This is an interesting factoid. So, this is a somewhat, if spiritual is not a maybe is a trivial way of describing it, but you center yourself basically by that sort of activity. And also about you, I mean, I'm curious. Actually, the first episode of this series was with Darren Hagen, who was somebody who had just written a memoir where he was confronting his struggles with things in his past, like addiction of certain sorts. So and what I'm getting at is, what is the material of a composer? Is there a common strand between composers that make them go between bright and dark places and constantly searching, climbing mountains, struggling with addiction, if you will? I mean, does that overlap with your experience as a composer?
Well, it certainly overlaps with mine. I learned so much about composing by going out into the wilderness, particularly, and not so much by conquering mountains, but by the patience and persistence of which I spoke earlier. I learned all that there. But how many composers? There were some composers, conductors and so on, who were mountain climbers. Furtwängler was a great, he was a mountaineer. Even Richard Strauss, I think, was a mountaineer. You don't have to do that, and you don't have to be a recovered alcoholic or addict. All of that can go into your music. What it takes to be a composer, and I think what we all share, is a willingness to take the time to delve in deeply into yourself and speak to people in a way that speaks from your depth, and find a way of communicating, which is, in this case, through music. You could also do it with painting, poetry, dance, and the whole drama and film, the whole 9 yards. Music has its own special territory, doesn't it? And I think that the preparation for becoming a composer has gotten a little bit, I hate to use the word elitist, but you know what I mean? It should not be something that I can get off on this, but one of my best teaching artists in Venezuela, he said, I like your program. I want all the kids to understand it, and it's not going to threaten the established professional academic composer at all. It's going to exalt them. I said, how? He said, well, look, I think he had two examples. One was, he said, take somebody who specializes in the Renaissance harpsichord or theorbo or something like that. If he's a great virtuoso on that, kind of, who cares, because nobody knows how to play that. But you take Jascha Heifetz, who became great on the violin, and then millions of kids played the violin. It exalted him. It wasn't that Heifetz had competition, but the kids understood what it took to be a violinist. It's just so with very young composers, because the so-called great, glitterati of composers, these kids will understand what a really good composition entails. They will exalt composers. It will be a skill and a calling that they know something about. They're not going to ignore it. All the millions of kids that play baseball, not very few of them are going to make the major leagues, if any. But the fact that they know how to hit a ball and how to make a double play or a throw to first or something makes them great fans of the professionals. So it's not that they have competition.
Can I ask you though to indulge as the ghost of Christmas future, and while bookmarking this and then saying that we want to end on a positive note, indulge in a little bit of cautionary tale about, is there something about the overall trajectory, non-specifically, about the composers you're seeing emerge today, getting programmed by the greatest of all palettes, the orchestra, right? Mm-hmm. That is concerning, if you will. And I'll add to that point, I mean, this Capricorn conversation idea is, to be honest, a little bit over nostalgic. The risk is that I continue to propagate what I believe actually.
Yeah,
But there was
we
this,
all do. Yeah.
well, no, as for me, there was this precious moment mid-century, okay, mid-20th century, when it seems to me that the greatest composers were thriving. And this is, this is the tail end of your time.
I hear you, yeah.
Leonard Bernstein, the era of those composers that we
Copeland
call
Barber,
and we call them American, whatever American means.
Yeah.
We don't seem to have that dynamic, truly overall quality of both tonal, lyrical, modernist music that continued to revere and draw from the so-called established classical traditions. Sure, there are composers continuing that lineage, but more scarce. Where is this going?
Wow. Well, that mid-century, more, I hate to use the word populist, but oriented, that Copeland's Appalachian Spring, let's say, or any work by Barber. Geez, just the School for Scandal Overture. I mean, gee, that kind of beauty that spoke to people, or even Copeland's Third Symphony, is what, as involved as that was, spoke to people in the World War II era. That was looked down upon. And I don't even want to get into this. It sort of became déclassé and not intellectual enough. Let's not even get into that, because there's a lot of great compositions that used dodecaphonic or serial techniques. It's not
sure. Barber's Piano Sonata has the last movement with serial techniques and so on.
I mean, there's the style is not the point. But I do think that for one reason or another, part of which may include that what we just said, that the symphony orchestra needs a shot of adrenaline. Okay, let's just put it that way. It's not going to die out, but it needs a shot of adrenaline. I think that a way to provide that shot is to, I hate to say democratize, make composition more of something that a kid does, like joining the basketball team or the ballet class, which is a common thing for kids to do. That music composition, if that becomes a more general thing, then you will see an art form rise. If I would dictate what that form would be, I would form a school of composition. I don't want to do that. I don't teach kids how to compose. They have to teach us. So you will see that. And I do feel optimistic about that. I don't know if I'm as optimistic about the ability of adults politically to handle the problems of the world, but this, I think, could help. So to end on a high note, absolutely. I think if we just listen, not just to children, but just listen to more voices that are coming up in America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, that live music will inform us in some way that I can never predict, and it will help us and make us feel more human.
Jon, my first memory of meeting you and seeing you was that behavior you mentioned of hovering around a performance or a rehearsal and moving around, feeling irresistibly moved physically by what you hear. But what that also gave me a picture of was somebody who was always absorbing the whole room, and what the music was doing. Not what it said, not the message that it had, and not how perfectly it was done, but what it was physically doing. And this mid-century nostalgia includes, yes, it was a period when the audience mattered more. The audience matters. Children matter. And it's interesting, you made the earlier point about how people need to be encouraged. Well, audiences need to be encouraged, right? or else they won't come back.
Yeah.
And I just love your spirit, because you do, if you are that person hovering around, engaged with everything that's going on, the audience really matters.
Yeah, yeah. There's the whole point of it, really, in a sense. Yeah, yeah.
Jon, thank you so much for having this conversation.
Well, it's my pleasure. My pleasure, Paul. I loved always talking to you. Thank you.